Good evening, everybody. You're very welcome to Traston the Tier this evening. We're back for our second lecture with Jim O'Leary. So Jim has spent a lot of his time researching County Meath during the times of revolution. And tonight he's joining us to speak about the strange and fascinating story of the 1922 general election, which has its 100th anniversary on this very day. So you're very, very welcome, Jim.
Well, thanks very much, Ian. It's nice to be back. And I should thank you for the opportunity it afforded me last year to talk about my book, The Robinstown Affair, A War of Independence Story. Since then, my interests have moved on to the following year, because the Robinstown Affair was a 1921 story, and I've been looking in particular at political developments in 1922 and subsequently. And so tonight's talk is specifically about the 1922 election. And you know, when we think of 1922, when we think of Ireland in that year, we're inclined to think about, you know, the treaty debates, the bitter legacy of those debates. Of course, our recollection of that year, our collective recollection, is dominated by the Civil War, which broke out towards the end of June. We think also about all the unnecessary and avoidable deaths that occurred that year, especially the death of Michael Collins. And we think perhaps at a stretch, we think of the creation of the Free State and all of that. But what people don't seem to realize, and what isn't commemorated with any prominence, is the 1922 general election. And it seems to me that it's rather a pity that that's the case, because the 1922 election was historic for a number of reasons. First of all, it was the first contested election in the 26 county jurisdiction, right? Secondly, it was the first election in which the destination of seats in the Dáil was determined by PR, the PR single transferable vote system. And thirdly, it was the first election in this jurisdiction that was contested by the Labour Party. And much more on that in a couple of moments, because the performance of the Labour Party in that election was quite notable. Now, I've just mentioned a few reasons why the 1922 election was historic. It was also remarkable. First of all, it was remarkable as to the context, because it took place against the backdrop of a very tense political situation, to put it mildly, and a fair amount of low-level violence and military engagement and so on. It was a wonder, in truth, that an election that was orderly and relatively peaceful took place in the circumstances, and more of that with the next slide. It was also remarkable because of the rules of engagement. And those rules of engagement were put together by Collins and DeValera, who agreed how the election would be conducted. And that agreement came to be known as the Collins-DeValera Pact. And so the 1922 election is often referred to as the Pact election, as in P-A-C-T. One could argue that a more appropriate word to describe the election, at least in terms of what Collins and DeValera were attempting to do, was the Pact election, P-A-C-K-E-D. And we'll come to that in a few moments. Another reason the election was remarkable was the results. And I can encapsulate how remarkable those results were in a simple factual statement that will be elaborated at a later stage in the talk. And that simple factual statement is this: that Sinn Fein lost 30 seats, right? It's not widely known, but they lost 30 seats. And of course, the other remarkable aspect of the election was the aftermath, because within less than 2 weeks of the Sinn Fein factions coming together to fight an election on a joint platform, within 2 weeks of that, civil war broke out, full-blown civil war. You could argue that what had been happening earlier in the year was a kind of a phony civil war, but it stopped being phony on the 28th of June when the National Army attacked the Republican garrison in the Four Courts. A little bit of political background, just to clarify a few possible sources of confusion later. Just a few words about the 1918 election. The 1918 election was the election that effectively marked the demise of the Irish Parliamentary Party. Sinn Fein won virtually every seat in the 26 counties from the Irish Parliamentary. I think the Parliamentary Party retained just 2 seats. And believe it or not, there was a unionist elected in Dublin Rathmines. But in every other constituency in the 26 counties, Sinn Fein were victorious. That was 1918. Then there was an election in 1921. This was an election that was held under the auspices of the Government of Ireland Act. And for those of you who've forgotten, the Government of Ireland Act effectively institutionalized partition. And in the matter of parliaments, it created parliaments north and south, what is now the border. So the 1921 election in the south was an election to the Southern Ireland Parliament, created under the auspices of the Government of Ireland Act. And that was an election that was not contested. The Labour Party stood back, all other political groupings and interests stood back in this jurisdiction and allowed Sinn Fein a free run. So there was no polling. Sinn Fein was returned in every constituency, bar the 4 seats that attached to Trinity College. Sinn Fein won every other seat, or took every other seat. That was the 1921 election. Worth mentioning, not that I need elaborate on it, the treaty debates, of course, an important part of the background to the 1922 election, the treaty debates and the treaty division and so on. And you know, the rather febrile atmosphere that existed at the time, the bitter divisions between the pro and anti-treatyites. It would have been impossible for any election to take place in 1922 and not have the shadow of the treaty fall over it. And finally, in terms of background, I should mention Article 17 of the treaty, which is essentially the article, or is the article which essentially required that an election take place in 1922. The government in place up to the point where that election occurred was a provisional government. The parliament was a provisional parliament. So there was a necessity to have an election and create a new constitution for the Free State and a newly elected government and so on. And there was a requirement under Article 17 that that would occur before the end of 1922. Again, I don't have to dwell too much on the backdrop to the election in terms of political tension, political violence, criminality, and so on. I'll paint the picture in broad brushstrokes. British troops had evacuated most, if not all, of their barracks around the country. They hadn't left all of them, mind you. Some of them were still in Dublin. They had withdrawn to Dublin. So there was still a British presence, a British army presence in the country at the time of the election. The RIC had been disbanded. and had evacuated their barracks. And one of the first set of flashpoints in early 1922 was around the takeover of these barracks that were being vacated by the RIC and the army. And a lot of those takeovers were contested between the two wings of the IRA. And some of those contests involved the exchange of gunfire. Some of them threatened to spill over into bigger incidents. Then, of course, another part of the backdrop to the election was the occupation of the forecourts by Rory O'Connor and his anti-treatyite comrades. The government, I mean, you can imagine, even in the best of circumstances, a fledgling government has difficulty in establishing its authority, and challenges in establishing its legitimacy. And these difficulties and challenges were amplified hugely in the case of the provisional government of what became the Irish Free State, because of political opposition, because the activities of the anti-treatyites actually created cover for what might in more recent times have been called ordinary, decent criminals to go about their business. So there was a lot of lawlessness about it. And of course, the political atmosphere was very highly charged. A lot of offensive rhetoric, a lot of things said that couldn't be unsaid, highly personal insults and questioning of people's loyalty to the ideals of Irish nationalism and so on. And then, of course, to cap it all, there were threats of sabotage. I mean, the anti-treatyites did threaten that if an election was called, they would sabotage it, they would prevent it from taking place, because they were hostile to the notion of an election taking place under the auspices of a treaty that they had essentially rejected. So the government had a problem. It had to hold an election. The treaty, the terms of the treaty required that an election take place before the end of 1922, and in some senses, the sooner the better. But there was this threat that if an election was called, it would be sabotaged and it would be rendered meaningless. So Collins and DeValera sat down and negotiated an agreement, a set of conditions, if you like, under which the election could be called and could happen in a relatively orderly and peaceful manner. And the essential ingredients of the agreement were that in each constituency, there would be a single Sinn Fein panel of candidates drawn from both the pro and anti-treaty factions in proportion to the division of opinion amongst the sitting TDs in the respective constituencies. So, for example, if you had a 4-seat constituency in which the sitting TDs had divided 50-50 or 2-2 pro and anti the treaty, well then the panel of Sinn Fein candidates for the 1922 election was required to reflect that split and comprised 2 pro and 2 anti-treatyite candidates. There was to be no hostile campaigning between the pro and anti-treaty factions. They were not to campaign against each other. They were to campaign on the same platform. And a coalition government was to be formed after the election. And in fact, the ratio of representation within that coalition was decided. 9 cabinet ministries, and 4 of them would be allocated to the anti-treaty group. Now, critically, one of the terms of the agreement was that other parties other than Sinn Fein, in other words, were free to contest, right? What was the motivation for the pact? Well, I think the motivation was different as between Collins and DeValera. Collins, it seems, his motive was, or his objective was, an orderly election, right? And perhaps also Collins was seeking genuinely to unify Sinn Fein, bring DeValera back on board, right? From an anti-treaty point of view, they weren't so much interested in an orderly election as such. Some of them may well have been interested in unifying Sinn Fein, but what they wanted, more than anything else, I suspect, was to suppress the treaty as an election issue. Because they knew, or they had good reason to believe, that if the treaty was an election issue, or even more particularly, if the treaty was the subject of a plebiscite, well, the people would vote for it, right? There was more than enough evidence to suggest that a large majority of people, even though they mightn't have been particularly in love with the treaty, they wanted to get on with their lives, and they were prepared to accept the treaty as providing the framework within which to, proceed down, proceed into the future. So the anti-treatyites wanted to suppress the treaty as an election issue. And part of the reason for that was that they wanted to avoid the loss of seats and authority, that an election in which the treaty would be the big issue would result or would cause for them, right? And there's no doubt, and we'll see this in a moment in more concretely, there's no doubt that there were some people who wanted to obviate an electoral contest entirely. They didn't want an election at all, and if there was to be an election, they wanted it to be uncontested. They wanted it to be a rerun of what had happened in 1921. They wanted to preserve the hegemony of Sinn Fein, of the men who had brought us to this point. These are the men who have earned the right to bring us to the next point, right? And anybody who opposes Sinn Fein is essentially operating against the national interest and is guilty of treachery or whatever. Okay. Reactions to the pact. Some of Collins's colleagues were not keen on the pact at all. They thought Collins had gone too far in trying to placate DeValera. And amongst those who had that view were Arthur Griffith, for sure, and Hugh Kennedy, who was the legal advisor to the government, but there were others. The domestic press, some newspapers, some journalists were relieved. There was even admiration for Collins and DeValera and how these great men had plucked peace out of the jaws of war. There's some skepticism as well. There's a mixed reaction in the domestic press. Northern Unionists were very hostile and very suspicious of the pact. And in fact, one of the suspicions was, well, this pact reveals to us what Collins and DeValera agree on, or at least some of what they agree on, but we think they agree on a lot more, and Collins is really in cahoots with Dev, and he's a bad person and we don't trust him, and this is just an example of why we shouldn't trust him because he's getting into bed with Dev and all this kind of stuff. The British press, actually probably the predominant feeling in the more objective British press, like The Guardian, was mystification. Like, what's this about? Why would a government party, which has every reason to believe it could outpoll the Republicans by a large margin if an election was fought on the treaty, why are they going out of their way to accommodate their political opponents on this? The British press, there was really no strand of the British press that could get its head around what the logic of this treaty was, or this pact was. The British government was hostile to the pact on the grounds that it contravened the treaty. It ran counter to the treaty, particularly the element of the agreement that anticipated a coalition government after the election with 4 Republicans on board. And the British government's attitude was that's completely contrary to the terms of the treaty, because the treaty requires that whatever government comes to power in Ireland must be composed of people who are prepared to support the treaty. And by definition, you cannot have anti-treatyites supporting the treaty. So the British government was quite exercised about this, and believe it or not, an Irish delegation was summoned to London to explain what the government had done and defend itself and so on. And it must have put the likes of Arthur Griffith and Hugh Kennedy, who were members of the delegation, it must have put them in a particularly difficult position because they were not fans of the Pact themselves. And they could understand the British objections. But in any case, the result of the talks between the two sides was that the British decided that they wouldn't repudiate the pact. They wouldn't pronounce the pact to be contrary to the treaty. They'd kick the can down the road and they'd wait to see what the election outcome was. And then they'd make a call, right? Okay. The election campaign, very interesting campaign. First of all, let's talk in terms of the Sinn Fein nomination. So these Sinn Fein coalition panels of pro and anti-treaty people, typically what happened was that the sitting TDs were nominated again to defend their seats, right? There was a few exceptions to that, but not many. And it didn't have to be that way. I mean, for example, in Meath, Sean Boylan's name was touted as a possible pro-treaty candidate. Had he accepted the nomination, one of the pro-treaty TDs, sitting TDs, would have had to step back. But that didn't happen in Meath, as indeed pretty well everywhere else. It was the sitting TDs who ran again. There was a fair amount of dissuasion of other parties. And the dissuasion ranged from kind of, verbal argument, appeals to patriotism, all the way through to threats of violence. And certainly there were parts of the country where, we'll come to it in a moment, where the intimidation worked. And there were other parts where what intimidation was tried didn't work. And there were parts where there wasn't anything in the way of intimidation, more something in the nature of a call to, as I say, patriotism or the national interest. Interestingly, the original pact was announced on May the 20th. On June the 5th, Collins and DeValera issued a joint statement. This, incidentally, released the day before nominations were to close. And I have the joint statement here. It's worth looking at. So actually, the key part of this statement is the one that's highlighted in yellow. And here the guys come clean, right? That despite one of the elements of the agreement being license to other parties to contest, they're saying here in the joint statement that one of the most obvious aims of the agreement was the avoidance of electoral contests, right? So effectively, they're saying here that we would have preferred, and we would still prefer, because tomorrow is the closing date for nominations, so it's not too late to change your minds, farmers and Labour candidates and so on. not too late to change your minds. We'd prefer if there was no polling. Because many of the dangers, I'm referring here to the last sentence, many of the dangers which threaten Ireland can be met only in keeping intact the forces which constituted the national resistance in recent years. In other words, the only way in which we can deal with our external foes is if we proceed on the basis of Sinn Fein dominated Dáil and government, right? And that statement was jointly issued by Michael Collins and DeValera on June the 5th. Adherence to the Pact. Was the Pact adhered to? Did the two sides observe the terms of the Pact? If you want a simple one-word answer to that, the word is yes. You know, obviously there are caveats, there are some qualifications. There's one exception, one or two exceptions, but Monaghan was an exception where Ernest Blythe and Owen O'Duffy doggedly stuck to the pro-treaty line in their speeches and in their campaign and didn't shrink from criticizing their anti-treaty comrade. But apart from that, there was a fair amount, not perhaps, yes, overwhelming, if not total, adherence to the Pact. Now, Republicans, anti-treatyites, would, of course, claim afterwards that the Pact had not been adhered to by the pro-treaty side. And one of the things that was pointed to as evidence in that regard was a speech delivered by Michael Collins, more or less on the eve of polling. It was 2 days before, it was June the 14th. He was down in Cork campaigning, and he said this, right? You are facing an election here on Friday, and I am not hampered now by being on a platform where there are coalitionists. In other words, where there are anti-treatyites. And I can make a straight appeal to you to vote for the candidates ye think best of, right, etc., etc. Now, this was delivered in a constituency where not alone were there both pro and anti-treaty members of the Sinn Fein panel, but there were also a number of independents who were pro-treaty, right? And J.J. Walsh, who was one of the candidates in Cork Borough, the constituency in which these speeches were delivered, J.J. Walsh actually went a little bit further than Collins, and he said, well, you can see what he said. Interesting. The intelligence and discretion which were necessary to direct that vote, in other words, his vote in favor of the treaty 6 months earlier, on my part, are equally available with you. And it's entirely a matter for you to do as you think, right? Now, during Trump's reign as president of the US, the notion of the, I think, was it called the wolf whistle? Yeah, it achieved some currency. This is clearly a wolf whistle, a kind of, or dog whistle, that's it, a dog whistle to pro-treaty members of the electorate to vote for pro-treaty candidates, right? So it was held to be contrary to the Pact. Okay, let me see, is there anything more on that earlier slide that I need to say something about? Oh yes, another curious thing about the election, and I don't fully understand this, and I don't have a whole lot to say about it, but I just draw attention to it, is that on the day of polling, right, on polling day, the government published its proposed Free State Constitution. It waited until polling day to publish this document. And of course, it was a document that the anti-treatyites found repugnant because it essentially formalized in the frame of Ireland's constitution so much of what was unacceptable to anti-treatyites in the original treaty. Okay, let's move on to consider the election results. So in terms of seats, Sinn Fein took 94 seats out of 128. Of the other 34, 4 were Trinity seats, so they were independents. So then there were 17 Labour, 7 farmers, and 6 independents, other than the 4 Trinity independents. So what can we say about that? We can say about that Sinn Fein lost 30 seats. Because remember, they had been coming from a position where they had, in the previous Dáil, they had 124 seats, right? Now they have 94. And they're divided 58 pro-treaty, 36 anti-treaty. And the 30 seats that Sinn Fein lost are clearly made up of 17 Labour, 7 farmers, and 6 of the 10 independents, right? If you look at seats that were contested, oh yes, that reminds me. There's something from an earlier slide I omitted to elaborate on, which is that there were 7 constituencies in the country where there was no contest, where the Sinn Fein candidates were the only candidates nominated. And those 7 constituencies were essentially along the Western Seaboard, right? Except for Galway. Galway, there was a contest in Galway, but there was none in Donegal. There was none in Mayo, most of Mayo, Sligo, Leitrim, Clare, Kerry, Limerick, right? The only candidates, as I say, in those constituencies were Sinn Fein candidates. Now, there were 34 seats accounted for by those 7 constituencies, and as it happens, they divided equally between the 2 factions, 17 pro, 17 anti-treaty. So when you look at the contested seats and who won those, what you find is that 41 of the contested seats were won by pro-treaty members of the Sinn Fein panels and just 19 by anti-treaty members, right? And if you prefer the currency of first preferences and percentages of first preferences, pro-treaty Sinn Fein just under 39%, anti-treaty Sinn Fein 22%, the Labour Party 21%, a proportion that they were never subsequently to equal or better, right? And that includes the Springtide and the Gilmore Gale. The Labour Party on both of those occasions won 19% of the national vote. But in 1922, Labour won 21.3%, and you had farmers then and others accounting for the balance. In terms of the verdict on the treaty, depending on where you come from on this issue, you can zero in on the crude measure, which is that only 22% voted for anti-treaty Sinn Fein, ergo 78% either voted for pro-treaty Sinn Fein or for other parties that more or less accept 78-23. If you are more inclined to look for kind of consolation as an anti-treatyite, an interesting thing to do is to look at the shares of the vote in contested constituencies where both factions were represented. Now, the reason I make that distinction is because there were constituencies where only one faction or the other was on the ballot paper. For example, Cavan. All the sitting TDs in Cavan were pro-treaty. So the Sinn Fein panel of candidates for the 1922 election in Cavan comprised pro-treaty candidates only, right? If you forget about constituencies like Cavan, because there were no anti-treaty candidates there and others in a similar position, and look at the division of the vote in those constituencies where both factions were represented, the pro-treatyites had it 35% to 24%. If you look at the success rates of pro and anti-treaty candidates. There were 48 pro-treaty candidates, of whom 41 won seats. There were 42, now, sorry, this is in constituencies where there was a contest, right? There were 42 anti-treaty candidates, of whom only 19 secured seats. So, and the other interesting thing is that there were no high-profile pro-treaty seat losses. None of the big beasts on the pro-treaty side of the debate lost their seats, but there were quite a number of high-profile anti-treaty candidates who lost their seats, including Countess Markovich, Margaret Pearse, who was Pádraig Pearse's widow, Tom Clark's widow, one of, there was Sean McSweeney, and, oh yes, and Childers, Erskine, or Robert Erskine Childers, to give him his full name. He lost his seat in Kildare Wicklow, and he got a derisory vote. He only got 400 or 500 votes. So I think it is impossible to counter the proposition that the 1922 election provided a strong popular endorsement of the treaty. I don't think there's any way that that can be gainsaid. Labour's performance was, well, stellar is perhaps an exaggeration, but it certainly was very impressive. Labour nominated just 18 candidates. They had 17 out of those 18 elected, right? They could have won had they nominated 2 candidates in Louth Meath and 2 candidates in Laois Offaly. They would certainly have taken 2 extra seats because they won more than 2 quotas of votes in both of those constituencies. They might also have taken a second seat with the second candidate, Carlo Kilkenny. So Labour could have had 20 seats. As I said before, 21.3% of the first preferences. And the regional variation there is interesting. It wasn't down to a big performance in Dublin, because in Dublin they only got 30%. But in the rest of Leinster, they won 35% of the vote. And in Munster, those constituencies that were contested, they won 21%. Why did Labour do so well? I'm not sure I can fully explain it. I think there is no doubt but that some of the Labour vote was a protest vote. Some of it was people showing their disdain, dislike, disappointment with Sinn Fein. Some of it was down to, if you like, an Irish stubborn streak that has people do the exact opposite of what they are expected to do. That almost certainly formed part of it. But another thing that without a doubt formed part of it was the strength of the trade union movement at the time. And bear in mind that the Labour Party and the trade union movement were more or less coterminous. I mean, it was more or less the same thing. I mean, back in the day, there was no distinction really between the trade union movement and the Labour Party. And in fact, curiously, it was possible, and it was not infrequent, for people to be both members of the Labour Party and members of Sinn Fein, right? I can think of one man in particular in Meath, a guy called David Hall, who for some time was both a member of Sinn Fein and a member of the Labour Party, and there was no apparent contradiction in that for him. So reasons for success, as I say, I'm not sure I fully understand it. There's lots more could be said about this. Maybe some of it will come up in the discussion afterwards. There's a table which quantifies the regional differences. You notice that Connacht, Ulster, or Connacht or Ulster are not included. And the truth is, it's difficult to put together meaningful aggregates for Connacht and Ulster. Connacht, because there were so few areas of Connacht that were actually contested, constituencies of Connacht that were contested. Ulster, because, well, Donegal wasn't contested, Cavan, as I say, that didn't have any anti-treaty candidates. Monaghan was slightly different, but the figures for those two provinces would not be very meaningful, is the bottom line. Pro-treaty Sinn Fein, 41% in Dublin, declining to 31% in Munster. Very much the opposite tendency in relation to, or pattern in relation to anti-treaty Sinn Fein. Labour we've spoken about already. And the other striking or arresting feature of this table is the figure for other in Dublin. And that's essentially independents, including business candidates, incidentally, but more particularly including people like Alfie Byrne and Lawrence O'Neill, who was the Lord Mayor at the time. These were very, very popular political figures and had a lot of electoral support, as indeed did Darrell Figgis, a man who fell foul of the Republican side of Sinn Fein to the degree that they visited on him the ignominy of cutting off his beard. They actually kidnapped him one night and inflicted this terrible humiliation on him. And as somebody who's worn a beard for over 40 years, I can feel for Darrell Figgis. Okay. Reaction and interpretation. Well, the mainstream press interpreted the results as an endorsement of the treaty, and went a little bit further and commented, indeed, celebrated the fact that the Irish people, in their wisdom, had overcome all the impediments that had been put in their way of expressing their view on the treaty by expressing their view on the treaty. That was the attitude of the likes of the Freeman's Journal and the Irish Independent. The Republican press took a rather different view. There was actually the next page, the next slide, I have an extensive quote from a Republican newspaper called Public na hÉireann, and I also have a quote from DeValera, so why don't we go straight to those. Public na hÉireann on June the 21st, apropos the election result, although you mightn't necessarily recognize any reference to the election in what's said there, which is interesting. There's much of the hard and difficult work of the 4 glorious years to be done again. Thousands of young men and women are ready to face the task, and it will be done the more securely because of the lessons which have been taught us all during the last 6 months. A clear, well, maybe not so clear, because it doesn't seem to relate at all to the election, but it is part of their commentary on the election result. And I suppose essentially what Public na hÉireann was saying is this election stuff is totally irrelevant. You know, this democracy in action, doesn't matter. Not when you've got thousands of young men and women who are ready to face the task of bearing arms and doing what needs to be done. And then DeValera, one of the architects of the Pact, it makes you wonder, I mean, what was this Pact about? These results seem indeed a triumph for the imperial methods of pacification, outrage and murder and massacre, and then threat with concession, the policy of the kick and caress with a kick in reserve. An extraordinary statement to make. But clearly DeValera was not happy with the results. And, you know, he was moving towards an interpretation of the election which favored the theory, if you like, or the proposition that this election was held under duress. It was held under the threat of some kind of British military engagement or whatever. Okay, I have one more slide. The aftermath. This is a short slide. And don't really have to add a whole lot to it. The election was on June the 20th. The full results would probably have been available June the 22nd, 23rd. On June the 28th, the civil war started in earnest, with the National Army attacking the Republican garrison at the Four Courts. And the fact that the election gave way so quickly to a huge intensification of the bitterness and you know, the transformation of what had been low-level violence in the early part of the year into a full-blown civil war. The fact that that happened makes the election itself all the more remarkable, that you had this period of 4 weeks of relative peace and orderliness. And as soon as it was passed, all hell broke loose. Anyway, that's it. Delighted to hear what people have to say by way of response or what questions they may have. There's no guarantee I'll be able to answer all the questions, obviously, because there's a lot of stuff went on at that time. There's a lot of detail that I'm only, you know, getting familiar with, and there are some questions that I don't have a complete answer to, like, why did the Labour Party perform so well? I'm not sure I have a convincing answer to that, because that question, I think in order to address it fully, you need to see what happened at the next election and perhaps subsequent elections. But the 1923 election was, if not a disaster for the Labour Party, certainly a major setback for them. They didn't build on their 1922 success. On the contrary, they lost 4 seats next time round in a bigger Dáil, and their share of the first preferences dropped sharply from 21%. Okay, thank you.
Thanks, Jim, and thanks so much for a fantastic lecture. I'm just going to ask you a couple of questions that are coming through in the chat box here. What about and you've probably covered it already, what about the next election and how Sinn Fein performed after 1922?
Okay, well, tonight's lecture was focused on the 1922 election for good reason. That reason is that I haven't developed my knowledge of the 1923 election to anything like the same degree. But what I can say is this, that in terms of share of the first preference votes, anti-treaty Sinn Fein, they increased their support in the 1923 election. Pro-treaty Sinn Fein more or less stood still. The Labour Party dropped sharply, right? So from a government point of view, the 1923 election was very disappointing. It was all the more disappointing since the expectations going into that election were that the government would do very well. And the expectation also was that the Republicans would do very poorly. And those expectations were confounded by the result. And part of the explanation for that, which was put forward at the time, was that the Republican side was much more passionate, right? Republican supporters, it was held, were much more likely to go out and vote for their candidates than government supporters were. And I suppose in that is a kind of a lesson for centrist type parties everywhere, that centrists are not generally passionate. Their supporters are not passionate. You know, they're pragmatic types. who are not animated by strong beliefs. And anyway, that's my take provisionally, my provisional take on the 1923 election.
Thanks, Jim. That's an excellent insight. I have come to the end of all of the questions.
Oh my God.
Let me see. I think I have one more there. How influential was voter intimidation, threat of violence, or the outcome of the election? Also, was there any evidence of voter fraud, ballot tampering, etc.? Jim, would you have any insight on that?
Not a lot, except to say that all of these electoral diseases were present. There was intimidation, there was impersonation, there was some fraud, but to what extent these phenomena determine the outcome or shape the outcome, very, very hard to say. Very, very hard to say. At the risk of being tendentious and partisan, I would say that intimidation was more likely to be exercised by anti-treaty candidates and supporters than the pro-treaty people. Now, you know, that's just a feeling I have. I don't have a whole lot of evidence of that, but there is some evidence. I mean, if you look at the areas of the country where the anti-treaty sentiment was strongest, right? These were the areas of the country which tended not to have contests, right? We're talking about the constituencies more or less along the Western Seaboard, particularly Kerry, Clare, Limerick, and so on, and the constituencies of Connacht. I would think that the fact that there weren't contests in those constituencies is more likely to reflect intimidation from the anti-treaty side than from the pro-treaty side, right? Now, in saying that, I'm not for a moment suggesting that the pro-treaty side was incapable of behaving this way. In Meath, the constituency in which I live, well, it was Louth Meath. There's an interesting story. There was a farmer's candidate selected to run in Louth Meath, a farmer from Castlebellingham in County Louth. And he was selected by the local Farmers Association or Farmers Union. He went so far as to publish an election address, so he was a serious candidate, right? But he withdrew the day before nominations closed. Now, it was never explained why he withdrew, but I suspect it was on foot of pressure from Sinn Fein. And I suspect that in this case, the pressure may have come from the pro-treaty side, right, rather than the anti-treaty side. Anyway, they're my thoughts for what they're worth.
Thanks, Jim. Thanks a million, and thanks for sharing your insight into this period with us. If anyone has any other questions, they can just pop them into the chat box. If not, we'll just wrap it up for this evening. Jim, thanks so much. It's your second time with us.
Yes.
And it's been really insightful, really enjoyed it.
Thank you.
So thank you so much.
And thank you for the opportunity, Liam. And may I wish you all the best with this endeavour, which I know you've been running with now for a while. It grows from strength to strength because it's a wonderful facility. It's a wonderful form.
Thanks, Jim, and hopefully we'll see you again soon.
Hopefully. Take care.
Slán go fóill. Bye bye.